It is my distinct pleasure to introduce a Pennsylvania farmer who came all the way here just to talk with us. And what I think we want to do is listen to the farmers tell their stories, and after that, then I'll moderate questions for the farmers. But I think it's really good if we just listen to what they have to say. So I'd like to introduce Pennsylvania cattle farmer Terry Greenwood. Thank you so much for coming.
I'm glad a lot of people come here to hear what I have to say. This might not affect everybody, but it might too. I'm a small-time farmer. I bought a farm in 1988, 60 acres. And what happened, there was a well on an old gas well that was drilled in 1921, and a lease come with the farm, a lease from 1921. It wasn't on the 60 acres that I had. It was on the other 40 acres. Well, I didn't think much about it in 1988. I didn't think I was going to do all this in the 2000s, you know, or back then, until they started coming to everybody and said, we're going to punch wells every 1,000 feet apart or closer than that, you know. So we bought the farm, you know, had our water tested before the gas industry come in on our farm in 2007. They come to us and said, we're going to drill 2 wells on your property. And I says, go on the old piece of farm where nobody's farming. I said, I'm farming. I said, I need my property. They said, we can do what we want to do, because we had that lease from 1921. But that old lease is so outdated. It talks about gas lighting and things like that in this lease. It don't even sound like a lease. So they said, you can give us permission or we're going to come on your property. And I says, I'm not answering you. I don't want you on my property. So 2007, November, they come on my property, cut the fence and come in on my property. So they tested our water prior to that. We had a well for drinking, a spring for the house, a good spring for the cattle, and a pond for the cattle. So they took them over a month to build the roads on our property. They come in the backside of the property. They built roads. It took them about a month and a half to build roads. They hauled over 200 tandem and triaxle loads of stone on my farm out through my hay fields and in my pastures to build these roads, to drill these wells. The first well they drilled was below the house, down below the barn, 450 feet from where our well was at, the spring, and the other spring was close to it. That was in January of 08. January 31st, my wife's running the water out of the spigot. I have a picture of it. It come out looking like iced tea coming out of the spigot. I don't know if you can see that. There's what the water looked like coming out of our spigot in a gallon jug. It looked like iced tea. It settled to the bottom there, but that's what it looked like coming out of our spigot. I called the DEP, and I called the gas company, and they said, well, don't drink your water. I said, what are we going to do for water? So 7 days later, well, we're buying water at Giant Eagle and wherever we could buy water at, because we didn't have no water, no drinking water. So 7 days later, they started delivering us drinking water. So we had to have a water dispenser. And to this day, we still have the water dispenser, and we've been paying for water for 2 years now. So when they drilled that well, they got done with that well. They went to the top field up by the pond where my cattle drank the water, started drilling up there. That was in February of 2008. The middle of February, in the snow, they was drilling, and the water's running into the field, and the cattle's up there walking around the fence in the pasture, because it was 75 feet from in the hayfield into the pasture where the fence line was. It was running into the pond. And I called the DEP, and I called Dominion Gas, and they says, the DEP says, quote, they dump it in the fields in West Virginia. I said, well, I don't want it dumped in my fields. So they didn't do nothing about it. They said, it's safe. There's nothing wrong with it. Well, in 2008, I didn't know none of this stuff. You know, it was all new to me. You know. So they didn't do nothing about it. They finished their well sites. Then they started drilling us water wells in 2008. It took them until 2009. They drilled 5 water wells. The last water well they drilled It was 300 feet from the well site down by the house. The old well, our old drinking well, was 450 feet. Well, they drilled the water, and it had high levels of sodium in it. You couldn't drink it. Well, the DEP sent me a letter and said, and Dominion Gas sent us a letter and said, we're discontinuing your drinking water. They drilled you a water well. I said, well, it's not fit to drink. And he says, it tastes salty because of the sodium because you're not using it. I said, sodium don't come from out like that. It comes from the well site. You're right close to the well site. It was right close to the pit. It was 300 feet from the pit where they drilled it at, right in the hayfield. And then I feed my cattle right there, and I've been feeding my cattle there since 1988. It was 25 feet from the pile where we feed the cattle at. And it had so much bacteria in it, they dumped Clorox and bleach in lines and said, don't touch your lines for 24 hours, and it'll clean it up. Well, we tried to drink it, and you'd spit it back out because it tastes like dumping a salt shaker in a glass of water. That's how bad it tasted. So we're paying for the drinking water, which cost us, last year was $800. The year before it was $800 just for drinking water. Then coming down to the cattle, when they spilled that water into the field and it run into the pond, the cattle was drinking it. I didn't know what was wrong. The end of March 2008, my cattle start having calves. They're dying. So by the end of the season, well, in July of 2008, we fenced the pond off to keep them away from the pond. I didn't know what else was wrong because we didn't change our feeding habits or nothing. And the DEP said there's nothing wrong with that water. And the DEP, they just tested the two waters at our property. They only tested the well and the spring for the house. They would not test the pond, and they would not test that spring for the cattle. They said that wasn't for human consumption. And I said, I sell my cattle every year for people to eat, and I said, that is for human consumption. And the DEP just ignored me and walked away from it. And this is how they treat you. You think it's easy, it's not. And it's all smart remarks, and you're not just fighting the gas company, you're fighting the DEP, because the DEP, to me, what they've done to me, they side with the gas company, which they're not supposed to. They're supposed to be a neutral people and do investigate and check things out. Well, they didn't. Yeah. Only thing they did was told Dominion to restore our water. And we've been watering our cattle out of a water buffalo. They've been delivering the water buffalo since March of 2008, and we've been watering our cattle. We had 19 head of cattle at the time. We was watering the cattle out of the water buffalo.
What does the DEP stand for?
Department of Environmental Protection. That's what the DEP stands for. Yeah, I'm sorry, everybody has different names for them and that. But we have a water buffalo there. They've been paying for the water buffalo. It was Dominion. In 2009, the end of 2009, Dominion sold all my rights to Consul. So I had an attorney at that time. Now I had another attorney, and they changed the companies around, so you got to start all over again. Out of the 19 cattle that I did have, I lost 10 calves that was stillborn and 1 2-year-old cow the first year. And the DEP says, that's a farmer's luck losing cattle like that. I said, you don't lose 10 calves and a cow in one season. You got a problem. And then I had to downsize. I'm down to 12 cows right now, which I had 19. And cattle prices are good, you know. I haven't made no money in the last 4 years, but I worked, my wife worked, we did okay, and our farm paid for itself. So I didn't have no issues there, you know. I didn't have no big overhead, you know. Everything was paid for in that, you know. And we bought our farm through the bank. We didn't inherit our farm. Because somebody from the industry said one time, well, you had your farm inherited. Everybody inherits a farm. I said, no, it was me and the bank and my wife in the bank, you know. But as for the gas industry, they come in, they ruin your water, and the water's more important than gas. You need the water. Once you lose your water, whatever money they give you, that money's not going to do nothing for you because you don't have no water. We got a 60-acre farm with no water now. Nobody wants to buy my farm. We can't move. I can't sell the place. I'm 64 years old now, and this happened when I was 60, and I don't know where to start at now. And they just deny everything they do to you, and they treat you like worse than bullying. If somebody's bullying you, that's nothing. You know, the way they treat you, they insult you, just treat you like dirt. You know, that's how they treat you. Yeah, They don't treat you like a human being in that, yeah. I said this before, and this is just my theory of what they're doing. They've been drilling around our place, and mine are the vertical wells. Mine aren't the deep wells. They're the shallow wells. But all gas wells affect the water. Their runoffs, their spills, which happened to me, it was the spills, and whatever else ruined the waters. It could have been the fracking too, but for the cattle, it was the runoffs. And I was telling Lynn, I said, we have places where it's been mined out. There's mines, there's blocks of mines all around. I said, they're drilling down through that. And I said, all this water's going into them mines. I said, and it's running out into the next creek. I said, and they're denying what they're doing? The water's not going to stay where they're drilling at. It's going to leach out into somebody's water tables. It's not going to stay where they drilled at. Yeah. Okay, thank you for listening to my story, but these are some of the effects that happens when they come on your property. Our well water, the DEP tested it, and environmental laboratories out of Indiana, PA, tested it, and they want to know where our filtration system was. I said, I'll take you up to the barn. Here's the water here. I'll take you down to the cellar. We didn't have a spin-on filter. Only thing we had a spin-on filter was the spring water that we had to the house for our showers, the washing clothes and things like that. I had a spin-on filter on it. There was nothing in it either. But they wouldn't test the waters for my animals, and that was my main supply of water for my cattle, the spring and that pond. And the pond still fenced off, and the spring disappeared when that well water went bad. It was about January 31st when that well water went bad, or drinking water, and then like the end of March is when that spring disappeared, because it was about 5 feet away from it, where it run right close to there, and I didn't disturb none of that water, you know. But then they wanted to come out. What their solution was, they says, well, we can put gutters on your buildings and that, and put a cistern in for you, and we can redevelop that spring right there. My wife said, tell them to get off the property and leave that spring alone, because it's the only piece of water we have left, you know. But they wanted to put gutter on our house and on the barns and build us a cistern. And I said, well, if it don't rain for 2 months, what am I supposed to do? And they just looked at each other, and nobody said nothing. And that was the last I heard about that. But they always got a trick question, a trick answer for you. Whatever you ask them, they'll say, oh, yeah, and then it's the opposite. But when they come on your property, when they got done in 2009 with everything, the landman was down in our bottom hayfield, and he says, the gas wells are in, we're done with you. And that was the last I ever heard from Dominion in 2009. And then Consul bought them out, yeah. But this is how they treat you. They just, and a couple of the guys from the gas company, Dominion, said, we can do what we want to on your property. And that's how they talk to you on your property. They talk to you real dirty on your property.